John Ulzheimer is known as one of our nation's most recognized credit experts. Having worked for 28 years in the credit industry, John has become one of the most prolific speakers about credit and the go-to authority on answers to credit-related questions. Credit Countdown with John Ulzheimer.
Hey there, this is John Ulzheimer, and today we're going to talk about kind of this very unique scenario with respect to the utilization of your credit cards. I think everybody knows that, unless you are new to credit, that there's a metric in credit scoring systems called revolving utilization, and it is the relationship between the balances on your credit cards to the credit limits on your credit cards expressed as a percentage. That particular percentage is influential to your credit scores, and the higher the percentage that you're using is bad, and the lower the percentage is good. So you want that percentage to be as low as possible. Here's how it's calculated. Let's say you have $10,000 of balances on your credit report and $10,000 of limits on your credit report. You are 100% utilized because you're using 100% of your available credit. That is not good. You want that percentage to be lower. Optimally, you'd like that percentage to be less than 10%. The people in this country who have the highest average FICO scores have an average utilization of about 7%. So that's basically 7 cents on every dollar of credit limit that you have that you're currently using in the form of a balance. And so you don't have to have 7% to have a good score, but you need to have 7% if you want to have elite scores. So that should be your target, less than 10%. So that means less credit card debt or more limits. That's just a math problem, so there's a couple ways to tackle it. So the question is specifically about, well, wait a minute, does that particular ratio, which we talk a lot about because it's so important, does that particular ratio consider closed credit cards? Good question. So if you've ever read any of the articles about what should you do with credit cards that you don't want anymore because interest rates are high or the annual fees are out of control, and almost always see some sort of advice, and you'll also probably see a lot of quotes from me because I do a lot of interviews on this topic, to be careful about closing credit cards because you could cause your credit scores to go down because you may lose the unused credit limit of the card that you've just closed. You may lose the value of the credit limit and that utilization percentage. So you may actually cause a utilization spike by closing credit cards that you're not using. But what about closed credit cards, for example, that are charged off or in some form of delinquency? Do those still count in your utilization? And the answer is maybe. It's a possibility that it will. So here's a couple of minimum requirements that have to be met for a credit card to be considered in that ratio, that balance to limit ratio. Number one is it actually has to be a credit card. A lot of garbage on the internet about, but I have a HELOC and my HELOC is destroying my utilization. A HELOC is a home equity line of credit. It's a revolving line of credit, just like a credit card is. And so for some reason, people tend to think that because it's a revolving line of credit, that it's also counted in that credit card balance to limit ratio. It is not. So stop believing Facebook and YouTube on that issue. The way that credit reporting systems are set up is they are very, very particular about identifying the type of the account, and HELOCs are coded as HELOCs and credit cards are coded as credit cards. And so it's very, very easy for credit scoring systems to differentiate between the two. So no, your HELOC is not accidentally being considered as a credit card in the utilization ratio. So number one, it has to actually be a credit card. Number two is that it has to have, here's another one, it has to have a balance and a credit limit, or alternatively, a high balance. And so this is kind of interesting. In order to calculate this ratio, you have to have a numerator and a denominator, right? You have to have two sides of the division problem. So if you don't have a balance, then you can't calculate a balance to limit ratio. You have to have a limit in order to calculate the balance to limit ratio, right? So if the credit card doesn't have a credit limit and it doesn't also have what's called the historical high balance, then the credit scoring system is going to bypass that particular account for the utilization ratio, and it will not count. Whether it's in good standing or in bad standing is immaterial. So the final thing to consider is what if it's charged off and it has a balance and it has a limit? In that scenario, it is very likely still being considered in the utilization ratio. And so in that respect, it's actually kind of hitting you twice. Number one, it's in default, so it's a negative account. That's obviously not good for your credit scores. And then number two is you are still, I don't want to call being penalized because the balance is legitimate, then it should influence your credit score. So it's not like it's a penalty. It's just the natural byproduct of having a balance and a limit on a credit card account that happens to be in some sort of negative or derogatory standing. So how do you solve all these problems? Well, number one is you don't go into default on your credit cards. Then you never have to worry about this issue. Number two is you try to keep that balance as low as possible, because if you're able to do that, then you'll never ever have to worry about the ratio. And number three is don't be scared to use credit cards, but just use them responsibly and just understand and acknowledge that if you do in fact run up large balances or you max out your credit cards, that's not a good thing. It's predictive of risk. It's predictive of elevated credit risk, which is why anything happens to count in your score. So if you have any other questions about this, drop them in the section below and I'll do my best to get to them. Have a great rest of your day and we'll talk again soon.
For more videos and credit tips from John Ulzheimer, go to www.tradelinesupply.com.